You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 398, John Adams's Inauguration. On March 4th, 1797, the presidency changed hands. George Washington left office, and John Adams assumed the presidency. The new government actually got started without the president. At 10 a.m., the U.S. Senate met in a special session. John Adams still formally headed the Senate and was sitting as vice president, but after Adams conducted the Electoral College vote a month earlier and declared himself president, he thanked the senators for his 8 years presiding over it and left the body. Adams had beaten Jefferson by a mere 3 electoral votes. While the outcome was expected, no one was certain. The electoral votes had been under seal until the count. Electors had told people who they voted for, but, some might have lied. Until the votes were counted, no one could be certain. Adams actually prepared for the possibility of a Jefferson victory in the count and practiced showing firmness and good grace in the event Jefferson had won. Jefferson had come in second, which meant that he would serve as Adams's vice president. Senator William Bingham, the Senate's president pro tempore, issued the oath of office to the new vice president, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson then assumed his seat as president of the Senate and administered the oath to the 8 new senators who took office that same day. Following the oaths, the Senate ended its special session and would not meet again for several months. Jefferson and most of the senators then walked downstairs to the first floor of Congress Hall, right next to what we today call Independence Hall, to witness the inauguration of the new president. Jefferson had debated not attending the inauguration at all. In the end, though, he opted to go, for fear that people would say his absence was the result of him being upset about losing the election. He had been at his home in Monticello in Virginia, but decided to head up to Philadelphia for the inauguration, arriving 2 days before the event. When he arrived, he called on Adams at his home in Philadelphia. It was the first time the two men had been in the same room for over 4 years. Earlier, Washington had written a letter to President-elect Adams insisting that he was happy not to have been elected president, that he wished Adams well, and warned that the Jay Treaty might lead to war with France. He hoped that Adams could avoid war. Jefferson also warned Adams that Alexander Hamilton, who still had an influence with many men in the government, would try to control his administration. Adams never saw this letter. Jefferson showed it to James Madison before sending it. Madison advised him to let Adams make his own way. Jefferson agreed and never sent the letter. It's possible that Jefferson discussed some of these same topics when he met with Adams right before the inauguration, but it's also quite possible that he just had decided to let President Adams make his own way and wasn't going to give him any advice at all. We just don't know what they discussed because there's no record of it. Now, they may have discussed France a little bit because the following day, the day before inauguration, Adams called on Jefferson, who was a guest at James Madison's home. This was unusual. President Washington usually demanded everyone call on him as a matter of protocol. Adams didn't seem to have this concern. When he arrived, Adams asked Jefferson to consider going to France to help negotiate an understanding between the two countries. Jefferson declined. He said he was tired of residing in Europe and that the vice president should not be out of the country for the long time that it would take to negotiate anything. Adams then suggested sending Madison. Jefferson agreed to discuss the offer with Madison, who was not present for this conversation, but Madison would also refuse to go. After their meeting, Jefferson moved into the hotel where Adams was staying, creating a message of unity on the eve of the inauguration. Adams's efforts to reach out to the leaders of the political opposition showed his efforts to support a bipartisan government and attempt to rise above partisan politics. Adams did his best to set the tone at the inauguration as well. President Washington had traveled to such occasions in a grand coach carried by 6 horses, usually with a military retinue. Adams purchased what was described as a simple black chariot, which simply meant a small but respectable carriage, and Adams used only 2 horses. He also refused a military escort or to have any retinue of public officials in a procession with him. He wanted to keep it simple. Abigail surprised her husband by having the Quincy coat of arms painted on the side of his new chariot. When Adams saw that, he immediately instructed that it be painted over. Any use of heraldry would certainly resurrect fears that Adams had a tendency to favor aristocracy. Adams also chose to wear a simple gray suit to his inauguration. It was devoid of any fancy buttons or buckles that were in style at the time. He did wear a small ceremonial sword, and he also powdered his hair, but then so did Washington and Jefferson. Washington outsimpled Adams by simply walking to Congressional Hall without any carriage at all. Adams opted to give his inaugural address before his swearing-in. He spoke for about 15 minutes and told his audience that he was out of the country as a diplomat when the country adopted the Constitution. He received the document itself before hearing from anyone about how it was being received, so he had no preconceived biases. He spoke of his support for the Constitution, the importance of supporting a Republican government against its natural enemies, quote, the spirit of sophistry, the spirit of party, the spirit of intrigue, the profligacy of corruption, and the pestilence of foreign influence. Following his speech, Chief Justice Oliver Ellsworth administered the oath of office. Fun trivia fact, Ellsworth was the first Chief Justice to administer the oath. When Washington first took office, there was no Supreme Court, so there wasn't a Chief Justice. In that case, the Chancellor of New York administered the oath. For Washington's second term, Justice William Cushing administered the oath. It's not clear why Chief Justice John Day didn't do it, but he didn't. Ellsworth had replaced Jay as Chief Justice about a year prior to Adams's inauguration. Now, following the oath, President Adams simply bowed and prepared to depart. Former President Washington insisted that Adams and Jefferson leave before him, reflecting their new rank as the nation's leaders. Adams noted that Washington seemed happier than he had been in quite some time. When he wrote to Abigail the following day, she was still in Massachusetts, he wrote regarding Washington, "Methought I heard him say, I am fairly out and you are fairly in. See which of us is the happiest." The men walked out of Congressional Hall to cheering crowds and cannon fire. Adams simply went back to his hotel room, alone. That afternoon, Washington called on Adams to congratulate him again and express his sincere wishes of success. Washington then left to attend a feast at another hotel in honor of his farewell. Adams didn't go there or anywhere else. He spent the evening alone in his hotel room. If Adams hoped that his displays of simplicity would engender some goodwill for his administration, he was right. As vice president, Adams had received his fair share of criticism, especially from the Republican press. He was too monarchical. He enjoyed aristocracy and sought to implement it in America. He enjoyed fancy titles. Political leaders had even dubbed him his rotundity. Benjamin Franklin Bache's newspaper, the Aurora, had been one of the most savage critics of the Washington administration, including Vice President Adams. In September 1796, during the election, an Aurora editorial told its readers that they would have to choose between a friend of liberty or John Adams. The paper claimed that Adams was a, quote, advocate for hereditary power. Following the inauguration, however, the Aurora was conspicuously respectful of Adams. It praised the new president's incorruptible integrity and the, quote, Republican plainness that he had shown during his inauguration. Part of this praise may have been a final dig at Washington, implying that Adams was showing good qualities that Washington had not. It might have also been that the paper hoped that showing some support and encouragement might convince the new administration to adopt some of the Republican policies that the paper supported. It may also have been a more general application of what we have come to know as the honeymoon effect, where new presidents usually get near universal acclaim, at least until they do something that the critics don't like. Now, there was some reason to believe that this honeymoon period might last for quite some time. Congress did not plan to meet for another 8 months, planning to begin its first session in November. Adams could run the day-to-day affairs of government without any real concerns of congressional meddling or criticism. Now, George Washington remained in Philadelphia. He was still packing up the presidential residence for a few days, perhaps even a couple of weeks before he finally moved out. Adams remained in residence at the Francis Hotel on 4th Street, along with Vice President Jefferson. When Washington finally did move out, Adams began the process of taking possession of the presidential mansion. This was not an easy transition. Washington had purchased pretty much all of the furniture, including the carpets and drapes, for the residence. He took all of that home with him, leaving a relatively empty shell of a building. Washington had a staff of about 24 people to run the household. These included household servants, laborers for the kitchen and stables, as well as personal secretaries and aides. At various times, about 6 to 9 of the servants were slaves that Washington had brought up from Mount Vernon. They, along with most of the paid staff, either left with Washington for Mount Vernon or went elsewhere. After Washington left, the servants apparently partied hard in the empty house for several days, leaving a huge mess. On March 22nd, John Adams wrote to Abigail about his first night in the presidential mansion. Quote, "Last night, for the first time, I slept in our new house. But what a scene! The furniture belonging to the public is in most deplorable condition. There is not a chair fit to sit in. The beds and bedding are in a woeful pickle. This house has been the scene of the most scandalous drunkenness and disorder among the servants that I have ever heard of. I would not have one of them for any consideration. There is not a carpet, nor a curtain, nor a glass, nor linen, nor china, nor anything." Fortunately, Congress had granted Adams a one-time allowance of $14,000 to refurnish the residence. This helped, but it was still a difficult transition. As president, Adams also received a salary of $25,000 a year. This pay, however, was not just for himself. The president had to fund his entire office out of this money. He had to pay all of his aides and secretaries and assistants. Rent on the presidential mansion alone was $2,700 a year. Formal events, banquets, and other presidential functions were all paid out of this presidential salary. Washington had ended up spending about $5,000 per year more than he was allotted, using profits from his Mount Vernon plantation to supplement those costs. Adams did not have a plantation. He had no slaves to provide free labor for much of the work. I just get this image of Adams sitting alone in this filthy, empty house thinking, what the heck? Eventually, they would pull together a workable staff, but until Abigail arrived in May, Adams was pretty much on his own in a near-empty house with no staff, trying somehow to start his presidency. As I said, Adams felt some goodwill from the opposition. He opted not to appoint any new cabinet members, but simply left President Washington's team in place, even though Washington wasn't particularly thrilled with the cabinet that he had when he left office. There was no tradition at the time to make changes with a new administration, and Adams decided it would preserve political harmony just to leave things as they were, showing respect for President Washington's choices and avoiding the appearance of appointing his own political toadies. Washington's original cabinet was pretty diverse. You had the Federalist Alexander Hamilton on one end and the Democratic Republican Thomas Jefferson on the other. But by the end of his term, the cabinet was pretty much all Federalists. The cabinet secretaries had no particular loyalty or allegiance to President Adams. In fact, they all seemed to be taking guidance from a private attorney in New York by the name of Alexander Hamilton. By this time, Adams considered Hamilton a political enemy, particularly over Hamilton's efforts to siphon off votes for Adams in the presidential election. If there was one thing that both President Adams and Vice President Jefferson agreed on, it was that Hamilton remained a huge threat to their administration. The fighting between Adams and his cabinet began immediately. Adams's most immediate concern was the brewing war with France. I mentioned before that Adams had tried to get either Thomas Jefferson or James Madison to serve as a special emissary to France, trying to get that lined up, at least unofficially, even before his inauguration. After President Washington recalled James Monroe and sent Charles Cotesworth Pinckney as his replacement as minister to France, the French government refused to receive him and sent Pinckney packing. In fact, they threatened to arrest him if he did not leave the country. Pinckney called that bluff, I guess. He left Paris, but he remained in Lyon, France. Adams proposed to send a 3-member commission to France to make peace with the French government. To mollify the anti-federalist sentiment that France was feeling, Adams planned to send one Federalist and two Democratic Republicans. One member he wanted to send was Elbridge Gerry, who Adams knew from Massachusetts and who had retired from Congress in 1793. Gerry was a Democratic Republican, but somebody who got along decently with Adams. The other Democratic Republican commission member he wanted was James Madison. Madison had just retired from Congress, not standing for re-election in 1796. When Adams mentioned this idea to his Treasury Secretary, Oliver Wolcott, the secretary told him that his entire cabinet would resign en masse if he appointed Madison to anything. Adams backed down. Fortunately, Madison didn't want the appointment either, so the matter didn't come to any sort of an issue. But it made clear to Adams that his cabinet was not there to support him and his policies. They had their own agenda. Over time, Adams came to the conclusion that his cabinet was a cabal with their own agenda, and that agenda was primarily guided by Hamilton. Even so, Adams kept his cabinet in place for nearly his entire administration. Unable to get a deal with France on his own, Adams opted for something that President Washington had never done. He called for a special session of Congress. During Washington's administration, Congress had gotten into the practice of waiting almost a year after the elections before going into session. They would begin meeting sometime in October through December after being elected in November of the prior year. The planned calendar for 1797 was no different, other than that 2-hour Senate session to swear in Vice President Jefferson and the new senators. Congress had scheduled its first regular session for November, about 8 months after Adams's inauguration. Instead, only a few weeks after his inauguration, Adams issued a call for a special session. He had his Secretary of State, Timothy Pickering, issue that call on March 25th for members to arrive on May 15th. They were coming to address the diplomatic crisis with France. The day following Congress's session, President Adams addressed the joint session of Congress. Adams informed members that the French officials had refused to accept the credentials of Washington's appointee, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, and even threatened to arrest him. France had also begun seizing U.S. commercial ships in violation of the Treaty of Amity and Commerce that existed between the U.S. and France. As a result, diplomatic relations with France were suspended. He noted that France's actions, quote, evinces a disposition to separate the people of the United States from the government, and thus to produce divisions fatal to our peace. Such attempts ought to be repelled with a decision which shall convince France and the world that we are not a degraded people, humiliated under a colonial spirit of fear and a sense of inferiority, fitted to be the miserable instruments of foreign influence, and regardless of national honor, character, and interest. Adams's recommended response was sending a new negotiating team to France to demand explanations for their actions. At the same time, Congress needed to start building up the U.S. Navy, improve coastal defenses, and enlarge the Army, all in preparation for a possible war with France. He did not call for a declaration of war, but indicated that the country should prepare for one. Federalists, who commanded majorities in the House and Senate, strongly praised Adams's efforts to protect U.S. commerce and his willingness to fight for American honor. Democratic Republicans were similarly outraged by Adams's position. They viewed French hostility as the direct result of the Jay Treaty that the U.S. had signed with Britain. Adams's speech made clear that he was determined to maintain President Washington's policy, which they saw as an appeasement to Britain and an abandonment of the U.S. alliance with France. The opposition paper, the Aurora, called Adams's speech to Congress a, quote, war whoop designed to provoke a war with France, not prevent one. So after 2 months of praising the new president, the Aurora returned to the same relentless attacks on the administration that Washington had endured. Now, no one seemed sure whether the U.S. would go to war with France or not. One thing was sure, though, the honeymoon period of the Adams presidency was over. Next week, a financial crisis adds to President Adams's troubles. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis and Gordon Kemp, and thanks to Robert Morris Circle supporters Curtis Johnson and Jason Googans. I also want to welcome new standard bearers Chad Reese and Sarah Natalie. My profound thanks to everyone who continues to support this podcast. This is what makes it possible for me to continue. I also want to add one final plug this week for you to fill out the online survey that I have posted for the American Revolution tour next year. We're going to use the results of that survey to flesh out the tour and make it the best possible history trip that you can ever take. You will see historic sites, hear from history experts, and get lots of background and context from me. For those of you who have already filled out the survey, thank you. For everyone else, this may be your final opportunity to have an impact on what we do on this trip. I have included links to the survey in the show notes and at the bottom of the blog for this episode. Now, this week we covered the John Adams inauguration for president. This really was a big deal. The whole presidency had been created with George Washington in mind. Now that he was moving back to retirement and another man taking his place, the whole nation would find out if it really was just Washington's leadership that made the American experiment work, or whether other men would be able to lead just as well. I also mentioned the unusual timing of having Jefferson sworn in as vice president about 2 hours before Adams was sworn in as president. Since one did not officially take office under the Constitution until they were sworn in, this means that Jefferson was actually vice president under George Washington for about 2 hours. Just an odd piece of legalistic trivia. I hope this isn't a spoiler alert for anyone, but Adams turned out not to be a Washington. As we will see in upcoming episodes, Adams lacked Washington's ability to unite the country, even getting them to accept policies that they did not like because they had trusted Washington's ability to lead them. Adams had barely won the election and became the nation's first one-term president when he gets tossed out 4 years later. Yet, despite his unpopularity, the presidency and the federal government generally survived this test. They continued on with the peaceful transfer of power to leaders from the opposition party. This is what was really revolutionary about the United States. Conventional thinking at the time was that you needed a king to maintain stability in government. Otherwise, warring factions would devolve into efforts to imprison or assassinate political opponents, eventually devolving into civil war. Americans were trying to prove that an agreed set of principles set forth in the Constitution could provide that stabilizing influence that others thought required a monarch. Honestly, I don't think Adams ever had the skills that we usually see in a successful politician. He did not like to put up with much of what he considered nonsense that can be necessary to form political relationships and alliances. He seemed to think that good ideas could stand on their own merits. By his own admission, he came across as annoying, abrasive, and not well liked by those who worked with him. At the same time, though, his drive, energy, and single-minded focus is what helped get the country to declare independence back in 1776. His tenacity and willingness to work outside his comfort zone helped finalize the peace treaty with Britain. His leading role in the government for more than 2 decades is what got a majority of Americans to support him as Washington's successor. Now, even if he had better political skills, we were already seeing that Americans were becoming much more divided over both economic systems and especially over America's continuing relationship with France. As we will see in upcoming episodes, that is what's going to dominate Adams's presidency, and some of his solutions to that problem are the reason that he does not get reelected to a second term. Even George Washington had faced bitter attacks from the press and the political opposition during his final years in office. Even though Adams had a brief honeymoon period that we covered this week, that quickly faded and the attacks on the president became worse than ever. Adams also faced internal attacks since his cabinet, which, as I said, was a holdover from the Washington administration, did not have any particular loyalty to President Adams. As we will see, Adams will face 4 very difficult years as president. Now, since we are moving into the John Adams era, I think it's a good time to recommend a John Adams biography. There are lots of biographies out there, going back to the one written by his son, John Quincy Adams. My book recommendation is one of the classics. It's simply called John Adams by David McCullough. This book focuses on Adams's professional life and politics from the Revolution through his presidency and retirement. If you're looking for a book that focuses more on his personal life, this is not the book you want. But if your interest is in his role in the formation of the country, that is really the focus of this book. And it's a pretty lengthy book. It's about 650 pages, not counting another 100 pages of notes and index. The author, David McCullough, is a very well-known history author who has also written the famous book 1776. His book on Adams was published in 2001, and unfortunately David McCullough passed away last year. But if you want a thorough look at Adams's role during this important era, get John Adams by David McCullough. My online recommendation is a link to the text of President Adams's inaugural address. It's very short and to the point, emblematic of the man himself. I always think it's a good idea to read their own words whenever we can, and this is a great opportunity to see what Adams was thinking at the beginning of his administration. As always, I've included direct links to the speech on my blog and in the show notes. My question this week asks, how come Britain didn't use as many troops in the American Revolutionary Wars compared to the 7 Years' War, which involved over 300,000 British, or the French Revolution/Napoleonic Wars, which involved over 1 million British? Well, the numbers of British soldiers in the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution were not that different. Now, you cite 300,000 from the 7 Years' War. I think that may be a little high, even if you are counting everyone who served over the course of the war. The British Army, at its height of the 7 Years' War, was around maybe 120,000 on paper, and more realistically, about 90,000 effectives. And that's only counting regulars. Provincials added more, but not that much more. In America, there were probably no more than 30,000 regulars during that war at any one time. These were supplemented by perhaps as many as 20,000 provincial troops that were raised in the colonies for temporary duty. The bulk of the British Army fought in Europe, with another large portion fighting to defend other colonies around the world. By comparison, the British Army grew to over 150,000 at its peak of the American Revolution, and the peak for the British was in 1782, and only a fraction of that army was fighting in North America. The largest number of British soldiers in America at any one time was probably around 30,000, and that was early in the war, and at that time they were also supplemented by about 25,000 Hessians. As the war grew, many British troops had to be redeployed around the world to defend other colonies because, of course, France and then Spain went to war with Britain, and Britain had to use the bulk of its military to fight off those threats. During the peacetime era, the British Army was only around 30,000 to 50,000 men worldwide, so spinning up any wartime army could be time-consuming and expensive. Deploying armies across the Atlantic Ocean was also expensive, required massive resources from the Navy, and had a cost. I read a statistic once that about 11% of soldiers who were deployed to fight in the Americas died from the travel either to or from America. Total British resources worldwide were larger during the Revolution than during the 7 Years' War, including in the American theater. You also mentioned the Napoleonic Wars. The number of 1 million men may be accurate if you include both Army and Navy. The British Army, however, hit its peak during those wars in 1813 with just over 200,000 regulars and maybe another 50,000 or so of foreign or colonial troops who were under British control. Because the wars over the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars stretched over a longer period of time, more men served in total. As I said, maybe 800,000 in the Army and another 200,000 or so in the Navy. But we're really talking, when we're talking about those wars, we're talking about maybe 9 separate, distinct wars over more than 2 decades. So, of course, there's going to be a larger number of men serving overall during that time period. But if we're just talking about the total number of men who served in the field at any one time, Britain probably fielded an army during the Revolution that was about 30% larger than they did during the 7 Years' War, and the Napoleonic armies probably saw one that was 30% larger than during the Revolution. Now, much of this growth can be attributed to population. In 1760, the population of Britain was around 8 million. In 1780, it was around 9.5 million. And by 1811, it was 12.6 million. So growing population allows them to have larger armies. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on X, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.